So, thanks for having me, everyone. As Chris said, I'm Steve Connors. I'm from Infrastructure Victoria, hence the logo. Going to be talking a little bit through what I've been living for the last 8 or 9 months, which is automated and zero emissions vehicles. Don't let this agenda alarm you. There's a lot to get in, but I assure you, feel free to just ask questions throughout. I haven't left a specific time for questions at the end because there are a number of topics, and I figure it's probably just easier to raise issues as they pop up. So firstly, a little bit about Infrastructure Victoria. So we were created in 2016. It was a commitment of the current government to establish Infrastructure Victoria. We have 3 purposes. The delivering a 30-year infrastructure strategy, which we did delivered late 2016. And we are tasked with reviewing and renewing that every 3 to 5 years. We're actually in the process of gearing up to renew our 30-year strategy. Should be consulting publicly on the objectives and directions of that in the next 12 months. We also just conduct independent research on infrastructure matters that we think are important or seem to be challenges for the state. At the moment, there's a large research program underway on managing transport demand, looking at non-infrastructure solutions to managing transport demand in Victoria in particular. And the third function, which I've been working on, obviously, is independent advice to government. There have been 2 such requests in IV's life so far. The first was on Victorian ports capacity, when Victoria might need a new port and where that should be. The second was for automated and zero emissions vehicles. So the Special Minister of State requests advice from us. The terms of reference roughly were to what infrastructure is required to enable highly automated vehicles. By highly automated, they are defined as the Society of Automotive Engineering's levels 4 and 5, which essentially requires no human interaction at all. Important to note that's not a Tesla and autopilot. The second is infrastructure required to respond to the ownership and market models that might emerge around zero emissions vehicles. We'll talk a little bit about the different ownership and market models that might emerge when we discuss our scenarios. And also just for zero emissions vehicles as a high proportion of the Victorian fleet. Interestingly, the wording around enabling automated vehicles and just for zero emissions vehicles has been an interesting element of how we've interpreted this advice. We've interpreted this request as the government has indicated that they want to enable automated vehicles, and so what do they need to do that? And more of the point for zero emissions vehicles, I think they accept that they're happening, so what do we just need to do about it? So for the advice, we developed 7 scenarios, which I'll discuss in the next slide. We focused mainly on the infrastructure and land use implications, and infrastructure was roads, ICT networks, energy networks. That was basically from an infrastructure perspective. And we also looked at financial impacts, socioeconomic impacts of automated and zero emission vehicles and urban design. And then in our final advice, which we're currently preparing to deliver to the Minister early next month, we'll be talking about pathways for responding to these challenges, what the infrastructure responses should be, the timing for these, when you would want to reevaluate the decisions as the technologies emerge. So these are our timelines. The initial request came through October 2017. There's a missing little point in here, which is Steve Connors recruited January 2018, I should say. Our scenarios report, which are our 7 scenarios, was released in April 2018. Brief consultation period. Frantic writing of our evidence base, which led to the evidence-based report being released in August 2018, which served for our consultation document that we went out and spoke to communities, stakeholders for the month of August. And now we've written and kind of refining our final advice to government, which will be delivered early next month, in the next week, hopefully, actually. So the scenarios. 7 scenarios, which deliberately are quite extreme scenarios. We've had a lot of feedback on our scenarios don't appear to kind of demonstrate a preferred vision or a most likely outcome, that's deliberate. We've picked these 7 scenarios here, which kind of test the bookends of what might happen and allow us to kind of turn one variable in the situation and see what the impact is, and then we can kind of form our advice around that. So scenario 1, Electric Avenue, all cars are electric, non-automated, so largely like today, except obviously internal combustion engine vehicles are no longer on the roads. Private drive is all zero emission, or all battery electric, all automated vehicles, all privately owned. So the fleet mix stays, as in the ownership of the fleet stays roughly as it is now, except vehicles are automated and zero emissions. Fleet Street is where nobody owns their own private vehicle. Everyone's served by a fleet of automated taxis, Ubers, if you will, which came along with some interesting findings, which we'll talk about a little bit further on. Hydrogen Highway, which is private drive, but with battery electric vehicles replaced with hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. Obviously that, from a road infrastructure perspective, there was no particularly different impact, but it had different implications for how the energy infrastructure might need to respond. Slow lane is where 50% of vehicle trips are still taken in non-automated internal combustion vehicles, and the other half of trips were taken in a fleet of robo-taxis or automated fleet vehicles. The purpose of this scenario was essentially to test a transition period where automated and non-automated vehicles are interacting on roads, which obviously will likely be the case for quite some time. High speed is essentially Fleet Street, but much sooner. So high speed, the scenario was set in 2031. All these other scenarios, I should say, are 2046 was our timeline. And dead end is our base case. So it was just a forecast of Victoria in 2046, what the road network looks like, what population looks like. And then obviously we moved different elements around to test the impact against the base case. So it was our foundation which we tested the implications of all the other scenarios. So I'm going to briefly just run through the 10 technical packages of work and the findings from each. There are a lot of slides here, but they're actually relatively content light. I'm trying to pull out some of the key findings, and if there are any questions that kind of pop up in your mind while we're flicking through this, feel free to ask. So transport modelling. We engaged KPMG to develop a transport model for Melbourne, which was the Melbourne activity and agent-based model. It differs from traditional transport models in that each agent can react to the set of inputs or the decisions that it's got to make. And essentially, so for Victoria or Melbourne in 2046, there are 8 million people. They have an origin and a destination, and they have a bunch of transport options. They can walk, drive, ride their bike and drive, any combination of these things. And they iterate those versions of their trips over the course of a day and find the most efficient route for them. And that's how they operate on the network. And so within this model, we could introduce automated vehicles. We could take away automated vehicles and just give everyone taxis. And so we were able to see how people responded and how the network responded to those changing variables. Unsurprisingly, all the scenarios with autonomous vehicles significantly reduced congestion costs across the road network. This was based largely on the assumption, which we have to note that it is an assumption that automated vehicles will travel much more efficiently than non-automated vehicles. There's a fair amount of literature around that suggests it'll be somewhere between kind of a base case now of 1 and a 200% increase, so a doubling, I should say, 100% increase, I should say. And so we sensitivity tested 2 improvements in efficiency, a 75% and a 25%. A lot of the feedback we've received on our consultation is that a 25% increase is probably the most realistic. So in our scenarios, we talk a lot about the 75% because that was the most evidence-based one, and we sensitivity tested 25%. We have that as a kind of a counterbalance that we will use and present in our final advice to the Minister, which will hopefully be released shortly after it's been delivered. So the interesting aside from the congestion improvements is the impact of a bunch of privately owned automated vehicles on congestion in Melbourne. So what we found is where an automated vehicle can drop its owner off at work or at school and then instead of parking, it can turn around and go home. There's a lot of empty running in the city. Every car that goes in turns around and goes back out again. It increases congestion by over 300% in inner Melbourne, which is basically everything from North Carlton down to Toorak Road, across to East Melbourne and West Melbourne. So it's a big area, and congestion is significantly worse. We found that where shared fleet vehicles were in use, so where we were taking away people's cars and requiring them to use the robo-taxis, the fare structure associated with robo-taxis pushed people onto public transport, because, so that initially seemed counterintuitive to us, but actually when people drive their car, they don't consider all of the costs of driving their car, they just consider their fuel costs. So there's a lot of sunk cost that's not considered in people's decision-making to drive a car, whereas with a taxi, all of those sunk costs are factored into the fare you pay. And even in the case of a robo-taxi, which in an automated vehicle scenario is much cheaper because it's electric, so its running costs are lower, and it has no driver, so there are no labor costs. It's still much more expensive than driving your own vehicle. So we found that where in a Fleet Street and a high-speed scenario, public transport use skyrocketed. Having said that, even regardless of what scenario we've used, even our base case showed a significant increase in public transport use in 2046. So all scenarios we looked at in future found that public transport is still very important. That was interesting to us because we thought there's a significant potential for people to substitute public transport for autonomous vehicle use, particularly due to the potential convenience of driving an automated vehicle, or not driving it, being a passenger in it. But even in private drive, which is the scenario where people own their own automated vehicle and can take it into work and have it drop them off and then it drives home, public transport is still twice, as a share of trips, is still twice as much as it is today. Great statistic. In the Fleet Street scenario, in which all vehicles are shared and autonomous, the vehicle fleet could be reduced to just under 250,000 cars. That would see the max or the average wait time, even during the morning peak, be around 2.5 minutes. So you would have to wait, around 3 minutes for your car, but that's still a significant decline in the vehicle fleet, which has some significant environmental benefits. But from an overall fuel demand, and from fuel I mean electricity, because these are battery electric, it's about the same as if everyone owned their own vehicle anyway, because each of those fewer vehicles are driving much, much greater distances over the course of a day. The reduced congestion across the network is reflected in average speeds. So the forecast for the base case is that the average vehicle speed across the network would be 37 kilometres an hour. With vehicle autonomy, that increases from between 41 and the lowest, which is the slow lane scenario, which is the mixed one, to 56 in Fleet Street, which has the lowest congestion. So this chart here is just it's a bit blurry, but it's the public transport trips by scenario. So you can see this kind of goes to my 2 and 4 times greater. So here we go. So this is today, well, today, 2015 is our base case. There are that many trips on the network. There's twice as much in dead end, which is our base case. Private drive is the next one down, still has 2.5 million trips. That's where everyone owns their own automated vehicle, nearly 2.5 million trips. And Fleet Street is way out here at over 4 million public transport trips. That's a huge, huge increase across the network. Interestingly, the mode of public transport becomes more diverse. We see trams and buses becoming more important in these scenarios because people use public transport to access more things. It's not just commuting to work, it's also going to the shops, going down to your local cinema, whatever it is people use public transport for. And buses and trams serve a more diverse range of origins and destinations than just trains, obviously, which are kind of main trunk services. This is a kind of a leading indicator of congestion across the network, average vehicle speed. So as you can see, the base case has a very low speed. Electric Avenue, which is where all vehicles are electric and non-automated, actually sees about the same. as you'd expect, there's no vehicle efficiency improvements there from a flow perspective, and then various levels of improvement depending on the makeup of the fleet. This is a bit hard to see, but this is a really interesting image that goes to my discussion about congestion in the inner city. So the red here is obviously Melbourne CBD and surrounds. The darker the red, the slower the speed is compared to today, and the thicker the line is the amount of vehicles on the road. So obviously the green areas in the outer kind of freeway and the ring road and whatnot shows vehicles travelling on a relatively uncongested network going much, much faster. The closer they get into the city, the more dramatically they slow down. And in the inner city, it's gridlocked. So that's a really high level view of our transport modelling findings. If anyone's got any questions, I'm happy to take them.
Yeah. I am really surprised. You're talking about modelling for 2046.
Yes.
For 2046.
Yes.
And I think most of us in this room would struggle to manage to drive anywhere at 37 kilometres an hour now.
Yes.
I'm wondering if there's any city in the history of man where you've increased the population of a city by as much as you expect and transport's actually gotten quicker.
It's a fair question. So that's an average speed across the whole network. So it's not just the in Melbourne. Equally, there's a lot of new infrastructure investment that's been built between now and then. So there's obviously, there are a number of factors, including that the public transport mode share is higher. So public transport has, population has increased dramatically. We've invested more in the road and rail network. So more people are taking the trains. So as a share of big cars on the road, there were fewer proportionally.
So that includes the speed on public transport as well?
No. But I guess what I'm saying is population is going up, but as a proportional population, there are fewer people driving on an expanded road network. But I do take your point. It might seem hard to believe, and I think
I can't think of any city where it's done it. So I just asked why.
But I guess this is a strategic transport model forecasting 30 years into the future. I think we have to take all of the findings with a fair grain of salt. But even if, say, the base case is incorrect or a bit too optimistic, at least everything's been measured consistently against that. So the findings aren't inherently flawed, I don't think, from the base case being incorrect, because they're all working on the same assumption. So land use modelling, this was our second largest package. This threw up some interesting and sometimes counterintuitive findings. So vehicle automation makes driving in cars more appealing. More people drive cars, places are more accessible, so people tended to, in the model at least, locate further away from employment and education hubs. So inner urban areas saw a pull away, but also a push driven by the fact that congestion in inner urban areas was much, much worse. They became less pleasant places to live. Overall population density remains largely unchanged. Just a higher density in the middle and outer ring suburbs, with a slightly reduced density in the inner urban areas. For regional centres in Victoria, Greater Geelong sees a significant uplift in employment in households, but and Ballarat and Bendigo to a certain extent also saw some lifts, but many other regional centres actually saw a relative decline compared to the base case when automated vehicles were introduced. These are just some underlying statistics to to further illustrate those claims. So the number of jobs shifting, number of people and jobs shifting in Melbourne under the scenarios is between 11 and 15%. That's interesting because, say, for example, the CityLink infrastructure investment, or the infrastructure project, saw a shifting of households and employment of between around 2 to 3%, which was significant, but limited to obviously the pockets that it kind of affected, the corridor that it was in. Because this is a network-wide kind of improvement in accessibility driven by automated vehicles, the proportion of people and jobs moving around is much, much greater. Interesting findings like Casey North seeing the most growth in all scenarios kind of it's an indicator of a no regrets thing the government can think about it, where we can kind of say, hey, it doesn't matter what scenario we plug into the model, Casey North sees significant uplift in people and jobs. So it's an area maybe to focus on supporting infrastructure. And as mentioned, Geelong is expected to grow considerably. We think that's because obviously already now Geelong is essentially a suburb of Melbourne. People use Geelong to access jobs and employment opportunities in Melbourne. And that is even increasingly the case when vehicles are automated in the future. Yes?
Just going back to the start of the talk, you were saying that the model is sort of it's populated by a whole stack of people,
yes,
and they make individual decisions based on the inputs to them.
Yep.
But surely you've got lots of rules in there, like how much people like living in an area or something. I mean, it seems a very complicated thing with lots of...
Well, the model, their origin and destination is fixed. So we have the land use modelling that we're talking about here. People can choose where to live and work based on how easy it is for them to get around. So this modelling built on the first package, which was the transport modelling. So they took data on how long or short people's trips were and how the network operated. So say, for example, a trip that used to take you 20 minutes to get to work, which now took you 15 minutes, people might move themselves 5 minutes further out to a bigger house. Whereas in the transport model, those things were fixed. And so they just made a choice of mode along a set route every time. They optimised the decision.
Yes. How much people prefer sitting in a train to sitting in a car?
They have time values. So each person might, depending on their kind of socioeconomic status and how much money they earn and how they value their time and etc., base their decisions on that. So every person is looking to spend the minimum time on it, generally commuting in the model. And so they try and optimize their decisions around that.
Okay.
So this is to give a sense of the scale of shift of people and households across Melbourne in our scenarios. So we're introducing a few variations to the scenarios along the bottom here. So I'll quickly explain them. Private drive is the automated, privately owned scenario with no mode shift, meant that people couldn't change between public transport and driving their own car from the base case. We did this just to first see if people kept driving regardless, what that would do to the public, what they would do to the road network before allowing people to shift. Didn't show us actually much of interest, so in the transport model, so we didn't look at that in much detail. Private drive, low MUT, which is people's marginal utility of travel time, is where we made, in an automated vehicle, we made people happy to accept twice as long a trip. So we halved how much they valued time in an automated vehicle because it was more convenient, on the assumption that that would make them willing to accept longer vehicle trips. Interestingly, as you can see, it's still significant, but like the difference between the low marginal utility of travel time and the regular ones isn't massive. So private drive dead running is the empty running of vehicles in the inner city areas, which is where we saw congestion in Melbourne. Fleet Street is our robo-taxi scenario. Fleet Street low MUT is Fleet Street with the halved marginal utility of travel time, which I just discussed, and slow lane is the mixed scenarios. So this redistribution of households and jobs is significant because, as I said, projects like the CityLink and the Ring Road generally led to shifts kind of in this kind of region here. So just the impact or the potential impact of automated vehicles on where people choose to live and work is massive by kind of major project standards. This is the household and dwelling movements in regional Victoria. The massive spike there is Geelong, and then the slightly larger increases are in places like Ballarat, and then places around Geelong like Barwon West. And then also there's a bit of an uptick in kind of the Castlemaine area, but then the rest of the regional Victorian areas are actually predicted to decline compared to the base case. To be honest, that's a bit of a surprise. We would have thought that the increased accessibility of automated vehicles would make people happier to live in these regional centres, but what we found was actually it was not the case. People preferred to cluster around jobs, essentially.
In Melbourne, there's been a lot of change in the suburbs where you've had dual occupancy and multiple units in what used to be a single residence, and also a lot of high rise in the suburbs now. Now that's clearly going to affect the numbers for a particular size of land.
Mm.
How have you been able to estimate that?
So that's a very good question. It's one that I can't really talk about much, SGS's model in much detail, because I don't know how that works. The technical report is on our website, and you're free to have a look at it. But what I would say is that each part of Melbourne has the planning constraints on it that are kind of in the planning scheme, and people reallocate themselves based on how their preferences or their time preferences suit them, and then whether or not the area can accommodate them. So if the density of the area they want to move to has already been met or exceeded, then they can't be allocated to that area and they'll be allocated to the next space. So essentially people redistribute themselves based on the availability of space, or just how densely populated the planning scheme allows the area to be. If they don't fit, for lack of a better word, they just go somewhere else. Yes, so the redistribution essentially meant that there's a relatively lower density in inner Melbourne, and middle and outer ring suburbs actually have a higher density, but only slightly higher because it's quite evenly spread throughout across all of metropolitan Melbourne. And so this shows that to an extent. So the pink is a decline in the number of, or the density, or the number of dwellings in an area. So that would be a lower density of households overall. So that's quite a large part of inner Melbourne that actually sees a relative decline in housing density. And then the increases are kind of mainly along major road corridors, because people obviously with privately owned automated vehicles are more likely to use their vehicles to access jobs and education and other services. And so they tend to cluster around places where they can easily get onto a main road. Any other questions about land use? I'm racing through it. Okay. We also looked at the socioeconomic impacts of automated and zero emissions vehicles. And by socioeconomic impacts, we were mainly interested in whether automated and zero emissions vehicles might exacerbate any existing disadvantage, particularly during the transitional phase where people may not be able to access, or there'll be differences in people's access to new vehicle technologies. And what we found was, unsurprisingly, people's access to services is dependent on the business model that is associated with automated vehicles. And by that I mean, if all vehicles are privately owned and as a result their perceived cost of use is quite low, people's access to services is relatively high. But where people have to pay every time they make a trip, they tend to not make that trip or access the services through public transport or other means, which actually decreases their accessibility. Obviously, that is quite a counterintuitive outcome, because people on lower incomes would be less likely to buy that car in the first instance and be more reliant on taxis or other services. So ignoring the sunk cost in the model kind of distorts this finding a little bit, but it's a limitation of the model that we talk through the nuance of quite heavily in our evidence-based report, and we will again in our final advice. Having said that, all people benefit from automation in terms of accessibility because of the way the network improvements operate, and people on lowest incomes have the most to gain. So even where there's a barrier to uptake for them because the cost of using a taxi is quite high, if there was a different pricing structure, like a subscription fare where you paid like a monthly fee and your actual marginal cost of using a taxi is pretty low, then actually their accessibility outcomes are quite good. Interestingly, there's a lot of talk about what automated vehicles might do for some industries, like people driving trucks and working, and taxi drivers and other transport related sectors. Automated and zero emissions vehicles are actually forecast to cause a positive economic outcome. There's a one-off loss of jobs that we would expect to see from people working in commercial and passenger transport no longer having those roles, but there's also kind of an overall efficiency benefit to the state that is forecast, theorized, to lead to more jobs overall, and those jobs are in sectors like manufacturing, construction, which are actually quite supportive for relatively low-skilled blue-collar workers to transition into those roles. So some kind of high-level statistics on accessibility. In 2018, 77% of Victorians have between 80 to 100% accessibility to train stations, schools, hospitals, activity centres, which are CBDs or regional towns. And as automation increases from 2031 to 2046, the number of Victorians with that level of accessibility increases. Interestingly, in a fully automated scenario in 2046, there are still 7% of people in Victoria who have between 0 and 20% coverage. That's people living in kind of rural and regional areas that already have very poor access to services. I'm thinking kind of East Gippsland is a prime example, where even with automated vehicles, the distances people have to travel to get to their local school or their local hospital are so great that automated vehicles don't do much from an accessibility perspective for them. So people on incomes of $700 to $800 see the biggest boost in accessibility. And that's largely because they're starting from the lowest base from an access perspective, whereas people on incomes of more than $900 a week have the smallest marginal benefit because they're already living in areas largely that have high access to services. The economic kind of benefit we talked about, so the efficiency impact of automated vehicles is forecast to push our gross state product $15 billion higher than it would otherwise be in 2046, which is roughly a 2% increase. And in high speed, that would be $10 billion in 2031. So significant enough, but still the work is affected by automated vehicles will probably require some support to transition to new roles. So these are areas of the state that have high access and low access, so high being above 50%, low being below 50% in green and blue respectively. Unsurprisingly, almost all of Metro Melbourne has very good access, and the places that have good access in regional Victoria are areas that are close to major centres. Other areas have relatively low access. I don't know, I really made a rod for my own back selecting this chart. Essentially, a flatter line, so these are the different colours are the scenarios we modelled, and the flatter the line, the more equal the outcome is for people on different income brackets. So private drive is the top one, which has the lowest gap between people on low incomes and people on high incomes and how well they can access services. Whereas the bottom line, press the wrong button, this line down here, which is our combination of the robo-taxi scenario, Fleet Street, shows that people on low incomes actually have a much poorer accessibility outcome than people on high incomes. This is just a point of interest so people who are likely to be affected from an employment perspective tend to cluster in like particular areas of Metro Melbourne. So people who work in road freight predominantly live in kind of outer western areas, and the same with passenger freight. So these are areas which are relatively disadvantaged compared to other parts of Metro Melbourne, and may become increasingly so in the advent of automated vehicles, and so could be worth targeting for a kind of transitional support for government. And this chart on the right here just shows the deviation from the base economic growth as, over time from the introduction of automated vehicles. This one always gets the most engagement, and it's actually the least rigorous of our packages. Essentially, the scope we gave to our urban design research team was essentially just think about what automated vehicles could mean for the way we design our roads and neighbourhoods, and be really ambitious about kind of how you might want to redesign them. We didn't really ask them to base it on any particular evidence we had. We kind of had a lot of research that we'd found, but it's also, I mean, a lot of this is very uncertain, but it's really just a kind of here's what we think you could do or what it might look like. It's not an endorsement of kind of what we think you should do or how the government or how local governments should proceed. So this is Chapel Street in a mixed scenario. So in this scenario, automated vehicles are white, regularly driven petrol, diesel vehicles are coloured. So what we're trying to show here is that automated vehicles can interact with public transport because they are usually connected, and so an automated vehicle can share the tram lane. Regular vehicles cannot. Cyclists can relatively safely interact with automated vehicles, again because of the connectivity and the safety features of automated vehicles, so that's why you've got this lone cyclist. But generally, as long as human drivers remain on the road, the scope for change is actually relatively minor. Whereas in a fully automated vehicle scenario, and so this is intended to represent Fleet Street, where people don't own their own automated vehicles, they use a robo-taxi, there are some big changes. So if nobody owns their own vehicle, for example, you can essentially eliminate parking. You've still got pick-up and drop-off zones for automated vehicles, obviously to drop people off at or near their location. But the amount of kind of curbside space you need to allocate for parking could be significantly reduced, which opens up possibilities for urban greening, greater pedestrian areas, safer cycling, any number of things. This is a representation of the Monash Freeway. This is in a mixed fleet scenario again. So the inside lanes are assumed to be automated vehicles, and the much higher level of blur on those vehicles indicates that in theory they're operating much faster and driving more closely together than non-automated vehicles could. We don't support, or there's been no evidence to suggest that actually kind of segregating lanes for automated vehicles is a particularly good idea. This is just kind of a representation of how one approach to integrating automated vehicles on the Monash. This is a really radical future, which we got a bit of negative media coverage from Gordon Rich Phillips about, where with a fully automated vehicle fleet, obviously the number of vehicles on the road or number of vehicles in the fleet is much lower, and they're all connected. And so because they're more efficiently operating and they can follow more closely, you can reduce the amount of absolute road space given to them. Hence, we've taken a couple of lanes off and introduced a cycle lane there. equally, the way that the road space is allocated could be changed dynamically. So you could have contraflow. So this is like an afternoon peak. You've moved the green line across, so all the connected automated vehicles are travelling out of the city during the peak, and so they have more lanes. Conversely, in the morning peak, that could change. It's just a more advanced way of doing kind of what we already do now from a traffic management perspective. This is Ballarat, Sturt Street. Again, so this is a slow lane mixed fleet scenario. The coloured vehicles are petrol, diesel, non-automated. The white vehicles are automated. Essentially, this shows that, again, as long as human-driven vehicles on the road, not a great deal can change. Whereas in an automated vehicle scenario, you can radically reduce the amount of road space. You can essentially eliminate most car parks, although recognising a regional centre probably would still need some car parking because people probably travel from further away to get there. So we've retained some car parking there. We've eliminated that road, the other two lanes on the other side of the median there, and also there's no petrol station. Any questions? I might run through financial analysis pretty quickly because I don't think it's the most compelling bunch of slides. Essentially, there's been a lot of coverage about how zero emissions vehicles in particular will impact on fuel excise revenues. Fuel excise isn't a state revenue, it's a Commonwealth revenue, and it's not directly allocated to the states, but we asked our consultants to kind of estimate, based on the amount of travel done in Victoria and the population proportion of Victoria, how much of the overall package of forecast fuel excise revenue would be Victoria's share, and then they assumed that they would be reallocated that back to us, and then we estimated that as a hit to the Victorian Government in terms of money lost for investment in transport infrastructure. We also kind of looked at how automated versus non-automated versus petrol vehicles, or petrol diesel internal combustion vehicles, would stack up from a consumer perspective in terms of cost to run. And also we asked them to just look at what do AVs and ZEVs mean for future like road infrastructure investments, and how do we think about discounting those projects and the life of them, and whether they're needed at all. That was quite challenging. So slow lane, which is our mixed scenario where people are still driving petrol vehicles, are still paying to have driver's license. Some people are still paying fuel excise fees. The financial impact is the lowest in 5.1. Fleet Street, and where nobody owns their own cars, all cars are battery electric, so there are no fuel excise revenues being paid. No one's paying vehicle registration because no one's buying, people don't own their own vehicles. No one's getting driver's licenses, things like that. There's a hit to the government of around 13 billion. It's a reasonable chunk of the Victorian Government income, not to be sneezed at, but compared to the, say, economic uplift that we talked about before of nearly 15 billion, obviously it's lower. And equally, we haven't modelled, there's a bunch of things in these impacts that we haven't modelled. It's a non-exhaustive list. So we haven't looked at changes to payroll tax. We haven't looked at changes to GST. We've just looked at things that are directly related to kind of vehicles, registration, license fees, things like that. We found that, yes, TAC revenue is included. And I've got the actual figures on another slide. But so the safety assumptions around automated vehicles meant that both TAC revenue is assumed to decline if revenue is based on kind of accident numbers and vehicle safety. And then there's obviously a tail to TAC payments because they're a long-term liability, but over time their expenditures will also increase, so it kind of nets out.
So just on the back of that, given that one of the things around AV might be given that one of the dilemmas might be in terms of who's liable for an accident,
Yes.
be it the manufacturer or if there's no driver, it can't be to the things. Could the TAC be broadened to cover property as well as the personal injury side of things? Is that something
That's a good question. It would be fair to say that the TAC haven't given this a great deal of thought.
I would imagine it's a bit early for them to do that now, but I mean, I think it's one of those dilemmas in terms of the onset of these ABs as to the legal scenarios in the case of an altercation.
That's true. So that's not partially, it's kind of outside the scope of our work because we're looking at infrastructure, but we have kind of flagged it as an issue that needs to be considered. And so it's kind of it's in our broader discussion, but we haven't looked at it in much depth. So the financial, that $12.7 billion impact could be offset by a distance-based charge on all vehicles of 18 cents per kilometre. That essentially is a slight increase on the offset or the amount that's charged in kind of fuel excise now. Obviously, we're not saying do this, but we just kind of modelled the impact to understand what government could do from a pricing perspective to recoup that money. But we think that there are a number of benefits, obviously, of automated and zero emissions vehicles that mean that putting a charge to kind of offset your revenue really doesn't reflect the benefits that you're gaining. So we wouldn't necessarily recommend that in this case. We also found that from a cost perspective, and this is kind of to counteract the really counterintuitive findings that say, for example, using a taxi or a robo-taxi is more expensive than owning your own vehicle, therefore your accessibility outcomes are worse, etc. This package looked at actually a cost comparison when you include the purchase of the vehicle and the running costs, and found that anyone who's traveling 15,000 kilometers per year is much better off using a on-demand vehicle, a robo-taxi, than using a privately owned automated vehicle. So it's a 39 cents per kilometre cost to use your own car. That includes obviously purchase, registration, whatever, whereas it's 24 cents per kilometre for using a robo-taxi, which is just paying your fare. That finding that it's cheaper to use an on-demand vehicle applies to anyone driving up to 43,000 kilometres a year. A lot of numbers here. So these are kind of the revenue, these are the revenue and expenditure lines that we looked at. I've kind of highlighted the biggest ones. TAC revenue is on there. Also TAC expenditure further down. The bottom line down here is fuel excise. So it's all of these zero emissions vehicles scenarios have a roughly $6.5 billion hit, which just assumes all fuel excise is eliminated because no one pays excise, obviously, on electricity or hydrogen in the hydrogen scenario. This shows the cost comparison of using a privately owned automated vehicle based on fuel type. So the dark blue is a internal combustion engine regular vehicle. The pink line is how much it would cost to operate a hydrogen vehicle over its life, and the bottom is a battery electric vehicle. And this is a cost per kilometre comparison of a non-automated petrol diesel, obviously automated battery electric, and automated on demand. So it just gives you a kind of nice comparison side by side. Per kilometre, using a robo-taxi is much cheaper than either of the alternatives. Any more questions on finance? So we commissioned some work on people looking at international trends around automated and zero emissions vehicles in other jurisdictions. Basically, we just wanted to understand how are the technologies evolving overseas and what are governments doing in response to either encourage these technologies or foster their uptake, incentivize them, or if there have been any kind of unexpected or unanticipated impacts. And then also and to translate that into a Victorian context, what does that mean for us? What are the lessons here? Oh, this is nicely formatted. So we got LEK Consulting to do this work. And so they essentially found that the only kind of must-do thing is to focus on zero emissions electricity production. This is due to the fact that without doing that, obviously battery electric vehicles may actually lead to an increase in overall emissions, particularly for Victoria, whose grid is still, for now, relatively carbon intensive. So from a charging infrastructure perspective, we found that a lot of jurisdictions, such as Norway, which has the highest EV penetration, has invested a lot in public charging infrastructure. Interestingly, it's not highly utilized. Around 90% of battery electric vehicle charging occurs in the home at the moment, or in the home, plugged in at home. So there's a lot of public charging infrastructure being invested in that's relatively underutilized. Obviously, that charging infrastructure serves an important purpose in overcoming kind of range anxiety issues, or for people who can't install chargers at home, they don't own their own home, or they don't have off-street parking. That's where we think public charging infrastructure might be very important. But at the moment, a lot of the evidence suggests that it's where we've seen it overseas, it's actually hasn't been greatly used. A really interesting finding for us was that the way roads are designed doesn't need to change for automated vehicles. We kind of went into this with this preconception that, you know, automated vehicles traveling closer together might mean greater loadings on pavements. So you'd need to significantly upgrade the strength of your roads, or you'd have to change the camber of the roads to account for kind of vehicle trajectories. Actually, what we found is that by and large, automated vehicles manufacturers are designing vehicles to operate on roads as they are now. Victoria might be one example to that, to the extent that actually we have some relatively unique road conditions, like hook turns is the main example that manufacturers often provide. But by 2046, obviously there are some assumptions about a level 4 or 5 vehicle would be significantly advanced, that it has overcome these issues. And so the way we design our roads is not expected to change. And I guess it kind of makes sense from the perspective of we wouldn't reverse engineer road infrastructure globally to operate with automated vehicles, whereas I think it's fair for vehicle manufacturers to optimize their vehicles for roads. So from an automated vehicle perspective, there's a ranking of market readiness here. Australia is not on this list. Just a bit further down. So basically, most of the, and represented on the right here, most of the activity is kind of happening in the US. So California, where there's a lot of AV testing, Arizona, where they've already got robo-taxis operating on roads, Michigan and Texas, where there's pilots underway, and obviously a fair amount of manufacturing occurring. From a regulatory perspective, places like Singapore and Japan are kind of quite aggressively targeting automated vehicle technologies, but their definitions of automated vehicles are quite different. So as a part of the research that we did, we found that, for example, Singapore and Japan both have pretty significant automated vehicle trials underway, but their automated vehicles are buses that follow magnets embedded in the road. So they're essentially a trackless tram. Their route is predefined and they only follow the magnets, basically. So it's not truly autonomous. It's not responding to external stimulus. It's not thinking dynamically. WIM is a case study we looked at from a business model perspective of automated vehicles. So it's a mobility as a service model where you pay a monthly subscription and you can access a fully integrated transport network that includes trains, trams, buses, and automated vehicles. we think this is kind of one market model that might emerge with automated vehicles, particularly robo-taxis. Equally, we think it could emerge before automated vehicles. Like WIM is not reliant on vehicle automation to occur. But it's just one of the things that's often spoken about, like mobility as a service is often spoken about hand in hand with automated vehicles. And it's an interesting model that would obviously require a significant rethink by kind of governments on how they plan public transport services. For example, Mikey would never be able to support this kind of service. So requires a bit more kind of thinking from government about how to respond to things like that. Hydrogen vehicles. I haven't spoken much about hydrogen vehicles because the findings on hydrogen vehicles have been quite interesting. And we'll talk a little bit about them in the energy networks. We've still got time, that's good. But globally, hydrogen vehicles don't have much penetration, obviously nowhere near as much as battery electric. The only jurisdiction that's really kind of pushing hydrogen vehicles at the moment is Japan. Japan are engaged pretty heavily with Victoria on extracting hydrogen from brown coal here. And they're using it as part of a broader kind of diversity of energy mix. They want non-nuclear energy, so they're relying on hydrogen, but also they're targeting hydrogen electric vehicles. I've got a target of 40,000 hydrogen-powered vehicles on their roads by 2020 and 800,000 by 2030. Which is a lot of vehicles, but in relative terms, I think their vehicle fleet is something around 40 million or more. So it's still relatively low. Just skip ahead there. So yeah, basically from a hydrogen perspective, there's not much happening globally at all for now. And part of that is the challenges associated with clean hydrogen, which I'll talk about a little bit more in the energy section, and just the cost of extracting it at the moment. Transport engineering is where we looked at kind of road structures and how we thought they might need to change to accommodate automated and zero emissions vehicles. I could really sum these next few slides up very succinctly to say not much. But I'll go through the process. Wholesale change not required. Automated vehicles will probably in the short to medium term still rely fairly heavily on visual cues like road lines, particularly solid lines, clear signs with speed indicators on them that are low text and high number, but not much else from a road design perspective. The way that these vehicles operate on the road, particularly freight vehicles, needs to be monitored, because while we say we don't think wholesale changes are required, if vehicle platooning becomes very common and you have large road trains of kind of connected automated trucks following in close succession on roads, it might impact on pavements. Where there is a significant scope for change is car parking, which we kind of saw in some of those images we put up earlier. But in a fully automated, low personal ownership scenario, 96% of car parks in inner urban areas could be removed completely, which obviously is a huge amount of space, particularly in, say, area, or even Melbourne CBD. But then, like, that's not just on-street parking; it's also parking buildings, which could be repurposed for other uses. So this, the road lines point that I made earlier, line markings are very important, not just for automated vehicles, obviously for human drivers. So existing road lines deliver like a significant safety benefit. And as long as there are human drivers on the road, which we think even in 2046, there are likely still to be some human drivers, you would still need kind of clear lines and road signs to a certain extent. So it's essentially we're saying automated vehicles are not going to revolutionize the way that we think and plan roadscapes. They'll look largely the same. So the 90 to 95% space saving at vehicle storage, that's the car parking statistic. The challenge that might throw up is the pickup drop-off zones will be obviously quite highly contested, particularly in high density areas. So governments, local governments, people who live in the area need to think about how that kind of curbside use is managed in the future. These are just some kind of images. This is what, in the top, they're kind of already examples of automated trucks operating in port environments. So in the future, that's the kind of thing you might see on your road in an AV freight future. That's just, the bottom is a picture of the West Gate during the afternoon peak. The point of that picture is to say that while platooning is a risk for a road loading perspective, that's 3 trucks following pretty closely together now. It's not really, platooning doesn't really represent a significant change from today in that perspective. This is some kind of conceptual looks at what how battery electric vehicles might impact on curbside parking. That picture on the right there is I think that's a picture of a street in the Netherlands where a couple of our team went earlier in the year. Basically, just the risk that on-street charges could become a little bit of an eyesore, or maybe even a safety hazard. And here's a kind of a schematic that the engineers drew up of how car parking buildings might evolve with automated vehicles. So you can see the top is kind of today, the parking bays are relatively wide. The vehicles need a lot of room to kind of move and turn around. One alternative where down the bottom there is obviously a significant increase in number of bays, but this is a private ownership scenario, assuming people still need to access their own car, whereas in the bottom, it's a robo-taxi where you've just got like fleets of cars parking, and then just the next one that's needed kind of comes off the rank essentially. So there's just the potential for massive space reductions from vehicle automation. Okay, so our energy modelling. Perhaps unsurprisingly, all scenarios where vehicles are zero emissions, either battery electric or hydrogen, are forecast to lead to an increase in overall consumption, but also without any demand management, an increase in peak demand. But the need for dispatchable capacity to meet the peak demand varies substantially between scenarios. For example, the fleet scenarios where vehicles are not in use or less utilised during the day during the off-peak period, off-peak from a traffic perspective period, means that the vehicles can charge during the day when renewables generation is relatively high, and it doesn't, meaning that they don't necessarily contribute as much to peak demand, whereas in a private ownership scenario where everybody's car comes and picks them up from work and drives home and then they plug their car in, means that electric vehicles could contribute significantly to peak demand in those privately owned scenarios. The impact on local distribution networks varies depending heavily on the type of charges. Obviously, regular AC charging doesn't lead to too great a strain on the network, but if faster chargers are installed, level 2 chargers, for example, or even superchargers, which are not unlikely to be installed in a home, but certainly could still impact on local grids, could significantly increase local networks. And not just the incidence of those charges, but where those charges sit on the network in terms of their proximity to the node. So incentives to reduce the impact on maximum demand, so say time of use charging or controlled charging, in which people can plug their vehicles in, but the charging actually doesn't occur till the off-peak period, could reduce the amount of network investment required by over $2 billion. That's across generation, distribution, transmission. Obviously, again, that varies by scenario, but the 2.5 billion is kind of the upper limit. And this is, with the energy stuff, it's all very interesting, and the government is interested, obviously, but ultimately, a lot of this investment will be borne by the private sector and probably, well, not probably, almost certainly passed on to consumers. So it's, even though some people in government might say, well, that's for the private sector to address, I think it'd be fair to say any efforts we can take to manage the impact on peak demand and lower the investment required in the network is probably beneficial for consumers in the long run. So of the 228 zone substations in Victoria, between 40 and 120 would be at risk of going beyond their rated capacity in a zero emissions vehicle scenario. That again varies depending on the amount of demand management or use of incentives, which can bring that number down. But even in the base case, some of those zone substations are likely to be under pressure. But that's just based on kind of forecasts from today. It's likely that networks will be investing in their infrastructure over time anyway. So that number is probably lower in the future. The cost of using a battery electric vehicle based on kind of today's price was assumed to be 28.6 cents a kilowatt hour is around $1,700 a year per annum. That's based on the number of kilometres, the average number of kilometres driven per vehicle. Obviously, for a fleet owner with vehicles travelling much greater numbers of kilometres in a day, that number is much higher. So this is a lot of numbers again, but so this is kind of all of the scenarios, and there's a number of kind of different things happening on this chart. Basically, the first red column is the total consumption or electricity consumption of battery electric vehicles in each scenario. The highest being the private drive scenarios where the vehicles are privately owned, automated, and because they're privately owned and the network operates more efficiently, they're driving the most number of kilometres, so that is the highest energy demand. The second red column is the amount of dispatchable generation required to meet the peak. In these top two scenarios here, which is electric avenue and private drive, the top number is the incentivized figure and the bottom number is the non-incentivized, no demand management figure. And that flows through to the amount of investment required. And that's and the next column is the non-dispatchable kind of baseload generation needed. So as you can see, there's a pretty big uplift. The middle column here is the uplift from the non-zero emissions vehicle amount of capacity needed. So it's a 50% increase, around 50% increase when all vehicles are privately owned and automated. The scary thing is if all vehicles are hydrogen. And that's hydrogen assuming electrolysis as its source. We've assumed electrolysis because in the absence of large-scale carbon capture and storage, which we still don't have proven at scale yet, electrolysis is the only zero-emissions source of hydrogen at this point. So this finding is interesting because it kind of, we have a very low level of hydrogen penetration now, and it would seem that the amount of investment and kind of infrastructure required to support a fully hydrogen fleet is quite significant. That's not to say that hydrogen doesn't have a future. For example, hydrogen has a much higher range to weight performance than battery electric vehicles, particularly for freight vehicles. So there are instances, and I'm sure that many of you will be aware of, kind of say, City of Moreland's work investing in hydrogen generation for their garbage trucks. So they've seen an opportunity to generate hydrogen on site using electrolysis and use it for their fleet of rubbish trucks. That it's kind of instances like that where there's a commercial incentive or a business case that stacks up, or a large enough scale, and freight operators are a prime example, hydrogen definitely makes sense. But from a fleet-wide perspective, the amount of energy required to generate the hydrogen for the entire fleet, and then equally the amount of distribution and fueling infrastructure also required to support that, seems makes it a bit of a stretch, I think. That's actually just my opinion. I'm not endorsing the opinion. I'm not endorsed in that opinion by Infrastructure Victoria. Yes.
Thanks. Stuart Nesbitt, Moreland City Council.
Hi. Right.
A good point.
Yes.
And it's one of the things that I've been doing a lot of work on recently in relation to our project, because essentially we've got a foot in both camps.
Yep.
We're very strong advocates of battery electric vehicles and obviously hydrogen fuel cell vehicles for the right purpose. And I'm actually putting together a bit of a piece at the moment that talks about that. So for obvious reasons, every vehicle on the road shouldn't be a hydrogen fuel cell vehicle. And there are advantages and disadvantages for the different technologies. And the piece I'm putting together at the moment talks about the reasons why personal transport, including automotive vehicles, should be battery electric vehicles because of their high round trip efficiency.
Yep.
The round trip efficiency of a hydrogen fuel cell vehicle is much lower, but then the advantages of power to weight ratio and energy efficiency on the road really kick in when you start getting into those larger commercial vehicles.
Yep.
Because it then becomes, it sort of stimulates the laws of diminishing returns. When you start putting, a large battery in a truck that weighs 6 tons,
Yep.
And you're toting that around all the time, whereas you can have the same power to weight ratio as a diesel and you can still have your zero emissions. And so the argument that we put forward is it's all a balance of everything. It's the right technology for the right purpose. And so our vision of a future in zero emissions transport is that battery electric vehicles will predominantly fill the personal transport space, and hydrogen fuel cell vehicles will predominantly fill the commercial, public, maritime, all of those, those heavy industrial purposes. Yep. And that's where you get the balance.
Yeah, that's a great point. And so, I mean, again, so one of the criticisms we got of our scenarios with it, they were quite extreme. And so when we throw up a number like this, the 147% increase in the demand on the grid from a fully hydrogen fleet, and that seems implausible and impractical, and you would never transition the whole fleet to hydrogen on that basis. But we don't want that to look like we're poo-pooing hydrogen generally. It's got its time and a place, and it's exactly as you've articulated.
Yeah, and really that's part of the reason why I've been putting this piece of work together, because in the time that I've been involved in this project, and I'm involved in electric vehicles probably the last 6 or 7 years, and that I'm seeing a building battery electric vehicle fraternity and hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicle fraternity, and they're arguing with each other. I said, there isn't an argument. You're both right and you're both wrong. They are different, and they need to be used for the most appropriate reason. Yep. And and people often ask me in relation to our project, what are you worried about hydrogen for when Elon says you can make it with batteries? And I said, well, look, I'm not going to argue the point, but it's what he's not telling you, and that is, well, firstly, what's his motivation? He's a battery salesman. What else is he going to say? But secondly, he's not talking about those points. He's not talking about the power to weight ratio and all the things that transport operators are really interested in. And this is one of the reasons why there's, most of the people in this room probably know there's a fierce battle going on in the US at the moment between Nikola Motors and Tesla Motors, because one of them's developing a hydrogen fuel cell prime mover, and the other one's a battery. And I guess you could say that the transport operators, which is the main game when it comes to the commercial vehicles, and they're the ones that have got to make the decisions. And I suppose if you didn't want to take sides, you would say that maybe Nikola are on the right on the money because they've got 10 times more orders for their trucks than Tesla's got for theirs. So and as I said before, it's not about picking sides, it's about using the right technology for the right purpose.
What's going to drive that, market forces or
absolutely
regulation the two?
Well, it'll be a mix of both, I would imagine, because essentially I don't know how you could regulate to mandate that you have to use a hydrogen fuel cell for a heavy vehicle.
You need the council, so don't have to get me in the council anyway. Would you regulate that, or would the market forces take place there?
Well, I think what you're seeing in the US is market forces taking place. I mean, you've got transport operators that have got billions of dollars of turnover and billions of dollars worth of infrastructure.
Economic reasons for them, regulatory reasons that make sense. So if that's the driving force, it doesn't need regulation.
Yeah, but I think. But I think that the point is that the starting point, I mean, where it all starts is that we clearly need a transition to electric drivetrains powered by renewable energy. And then once you've made that decision, and that should be a regulation decision, that we should be, you know, carbon taxing the hell out of internal combustion engines, and that's all there is to it. But essentially, once you've passed that milepost, then you've got to choose the right direction to go as far as actually your fuel source is concerned. Still renewable energy. But at the end of the day, I think that you're right, the cream will rise to the top. You know, people will realise that there are better ways to do it, and more efficient ways to do it. And there are swings and slide scenarios on both sides of the fence. You know, I mean, part of the reason that hydrogen has been poo-pooed for many years is one, the inefficiencies associated with, you know, the well to wheel or tank to wheel and well to tank. But you've got to look at the cradle to grave. And when you look at that, there's actually this formula that's called energy saved on invested. And basically it's the relationship between all of the raw materials that it took to actually make a battery electric vehicle and then an equivalent hydrogen fuel cell vehicle. And when you look at that cradle to grave, including, you know, sourcing all that raw material, making the vehicle, operating it over its lifetime, and then actually retiring it and recycling it, the hydrogen fuel cell vehicle comes out more favourable when you look at just at that ratio. And that ratio then gets wider when you start talking about wanting to use battery electric vehicles for heavy vehicles where the battery's got to get bigger. But the difference is that the battery electric vehicle has got a very superior round trip efficiency. So once you've actually invested in that energy to make the battery and you put it in the right vehicle, then you've got really high efficiency for the rest of that vehicle's life. And that's one of the reasons why I've actually drawn a line in the sand with this piece of work that I'm doing, saying that if you've got a mobility scenario and you require up to or greater than 80 kilowatt hours of onboard energy carried to actually to deliver what that vehicle is supposed to do, that's the tipping point where you would move to the hydrogen fuel cell, because increasing the amount of energy density in your battery exponentially increases the weight of the vehicle, which reduces its efficiency on the road. And so again, it's not about picking winners, it's about using the batteries on that side and the hydrogen fuel cells on that side, and that's the most efficient way to go forward. And why we obviously wouldn't want everything to be hydrogen fuel cell, for the same reason we wouldn't want everything to be batteries, because there literally isn't enough resources to do it.
That's not true.
Well,
that's just not even close to true.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is that
not.
Okay.
But there's not enough materials to make batteries. That's, look, we've all seen some interesting things tonight, but that's.
What the point I was trying to make was it's about using an enormous amount of resources for the wrong application. Use the resources for the right application. That's what I'm talking about, and that's where we see it.
Thank you. Well, I'm glad that I referenced Moreland appropriately. It's very lucky for me. Yeah, there's not a lot of numbers on here, but not a lot to say. So obviously the kind of corollary of the amount of dispatchable generation required is kind of the funding required to support it. So you've got that's too small to read, but say for a fleet of fully battery electric vehicles with demand management or price incentives, the amount of investment required in the network is around 6.4 billion. But without any demand management, it's closer to 8.8, a lot of money. And so this is a kind of a demand profile between the incentivized and non-incentivized scenarios for Electric Avenue. So what you've got on the left is obviously the non-incentivized, and it's the impact on maximum demand, because regardless of incentives, total energy consumption doesn't change. So we're just talking about maximum demand here. So on the left, much greater shortfall in generation capacity at the peak, as opposed to on the right with it, where incentives are in place. This is a spatial representation of the zone substations in Victoria. So this is in private drive, so all automated, all battery electric. The darker red the substation is, the further in excess of its projected rated capacity it will be. So the pattern we see here is that many, if not all, but certainly most substations in regional areas would be under significant pressure, and also in high growth areas and kind of the outer west of Melbourne and the southeastern suburbs. Any other questions? Comments? Happy to take comments. So ICT infrastructure. Automated vehicles were assumed to be generating a lot of data and transmitting a lot of data at all times. We found that we've kind of forecasted and modeled, we had WSP doing this work for us, that the amount of data being transmitted is actually not significant, kind of compared to the personal data consumption of users. So for example, I think I might have the numbers on the next slide. Yes, so I'll go back and I'll get to the number. Numbers won't necessarily be a challenge. What will be a challenge is a central source of data for automated vehicles. They're going to need up-to-date data for changed traffic conditions, such as incidents, roadworks, storms, flooding, etc. So that goes to the next point as well. Dynamic road conditions are important. So data sharing between government and vehicle operators is key. For efficiency, for the maximum efficiency gains of automated vehicles, that 25 to 75% flow improvement we talked about earlier, they'll need to be connected to each other. So that will we could either occur through, say, 4G, 5G, or direct short-range communication, DSRC. The technologies are kind of, the jury's out on which technology will emerge. Likely it could be both, as acting as redundancy for one another. How automated vehicles interact with vulnerable road users such as pedestrians and cyclists is still kind of unknown. Some kind of maybe opt-in system for people to kind of have like an RFID chip on their bike helmet or something might be one approach to managing that. But by and large, that kind of goes to, again, the need for clear signage and clear lines, because vulnerable road users will still need those things for their own wayfinding so they don't stray into traffic or cross at the wrong place. So although additional data needs aren't kind of essential for automated vehicles, the connection to each other is, as I said. So they'll rely mainly on cellular data to kind of be connected and talking to each other. That means that the upgrades that will likely be required are just more cell towers. To achieve coverage on Victoria's main roads alone, it's an additional around 134 cell towers from where we think the number of cell towers will be in 2046. And to cover all sealed roads in Victoria, it's just about 2,100 cell towers, so while we think automated vehicles need to be connected to achieve their optimum efficiency and safety, they're likely to be able to run at a degraded or less optimal state without that connection. So say people who live in regional areas with, say, long driveways that obviously aren't on main roads, they're gravel roads. The automated vehicles may still be able to operate, but won't have all the safety functions that they would on a sealed road. So that is an area that may not be covered in that 2098 cell towers, and may not necessarily need to be covered for the vehicle to do the task that it needs to do, which is just get to your house from the start of your driveway or something like that. So the amount of data transmitted by AVs is expected to be around 500 megabytes a month, which is not as much as we expected it to be. And then compared to how much data people will just be consuming per month, consuming and transmitting, is forecast to be 125.8 gigabytes. That kind of goes hand in hand with some interesting feedback we got when we were speaking to the telcos and doing this work, when we asked kind of what planning they were doing from a network perspective for automated vehicles. They said, oh, we're just kind of planning for the additional data needs of people who will be able to consume media in their cars because they don't have to focus on driving anymore. So the data needs of people watching YouTube in their car are higher than the car like transmitting its data. It's still taking in a lot of data from kind of a navigational perspective, but it's not transmitting all of that data. So it's probably transmitting its GPS coordinates and its elevation and things like that, but it's not sending out 3D renders of its location all the time. So that's why we don't think they'll be transmitting that much. Data storage, which is, it will likely be important for things like insurance, where if there's an incident involving automated vehicles, the vehicle data will need to be held for a period of time for people to investigate those accidents. So the data storage needs are likely to be quite high. So this is a map of, the dots on this map are cell towers. The coloured lines are different types of roads. So the road classifications, the main roads being M, and then roads A, B, and C class roads. Blue ones are M, they're kind of your main roads. So these are all of the cell towers that would be needed for, across the whole network. This is just the cell towers for the sealed road. So it's the first, the 138, I think it was. This is the next layer of next roads down. It's a lot of towers. And then this is the next layer down again. So, I mean, you can see it's in less densely populated parts of Victoria, where people still have a lot to gain from automated vehicles, particularly from a safety perspective, because people in regional and rural areas are much more likely to die on roads than people in urban areas. So there's still a very strong case to be made for putting cell towers into regional areas, but there's a lot more work that needs to be done in terms of whether it actually stacks up commercially, and then where it doesn't stack up commercially, what the role of government actually is in stepping in and filling that gap. So from an environment and population health perspective, we looked at a few things. We looked at obviously greenhouse gas emissions, particulate matter emissions, the safety benefits, well, the assumed safety benefits of automated vehicles, and also the waste impacts of disposing of specifically battery electric vehicles. As would be expected, a fully zero emissions vehicle fleet would eliminate greenhouse gas emissions on Victorian roads. The benefits of these emissions being removed is obviously most acute in densely populated areas or areas on road corridors. The potential downside is the significant increase in lithium-ion battery waste and e-waste associated with automated and zero emissions vehicles. To measure the health impacts of zero emissions vehicles, Oricon, who was our consultant team on this, calculated the avoided disability adjusted life years associated with the reduction in vehicle emissions. So they found that in our base case dead end scenario, where all vehicles are still internal combustion engine non-automated, there would be a total of 5,500 approximately disability adjusted life years that result from vehicle emissions. And so a disability adjusted life year, a number of 1 is death, number of 0 is full health, and so the scale is between 0 and 1, and it's adjusted depending on the severity of the illness. So in a fully zero emissions vehicle fleet, that number could be reduced to a little over 1,500 disability adjusted life years. So it avoids nearly 4,000. And that's mainly from the elimination of particulate matter and other kind of harmful emissions, sulfur oxide, etc. The reason that's not down to 0 is because there are still some particulate matter emissions from like road wear, brake wear, things like that. The amount of CO2 equivalent removed from the atmosphere in Victoria would be 27 million tonnes. That's equivalent to 25% of Victoria's greenhouse gas emissions in 2015, significant number. And the improved vehicle safety could avoid nearly 22,000 accidents with an associated cost of nearly $1 billion. However, there will be a forecast of nearly 220 tonnes of new e-waste, new battery waste, and 80,000 tonnes of e-waste. The Victorian government is already thinking about battery recycling and new ways of dealing with e-waste, because e-waste has been growing dramatically, but these numbers are far outstrip kind of the level of growth that we've seen so far. And so will really require a considered response, not just in waste disposal, but also recycling, because there is a significant opportunity for recycling the components of lithium-ion batteries. So this is just a map of the metropolitan Melbourne area and the areas that have the highest health benefits or avoided disability adjusted life years from zero emissions vehicles. Predominantly the high populated areas and areas along the road corridors, like CityLink is a really clear one here. Less interestingly, the Victorian map, it's areas that are towns. People have the highest benefit. A little bit kind of self-evident, I think, in hindsight. This is engine noise or vehicle noise for a heavy vehicle. What we see is that at low speeds, the zero emissions vehicle is much, much quieter than an internal combustion vehicle. But then as the speeds converge, the difference in vehicle noise is actually not so significant. And it's because of the proportion of vehicle noise that's just kind of tire noise and kind of aerodynamics, things like that. But it's still important from a say freight movement perspective, because a lot of freight movements, particularly in urban areas, could probably occurring in high stop-start or relatively low-speed areas anyway. So there could be some real amenity benefits from moving to zero emissions vehicles from that perspective, particularly for freight operators. These are particulate and matter emissions in the base case. So the green and sort of orangey red, which doesn't show up, the orangey red doesn't show up that well, is a high level of particulate matter, and the blue is low. So that's where vehicles are still internal combustion and non-automated. And then this is the same for a Fleet Street scenario, so automated, non-privately owned. So particulate matter emissions significantly reduced. This has the highest health benefit for Victorians from a kind of respiratory and other illness impact. Oh, that's it. Wow. Okay. Any other questions? Sir.
You had, I think, 9 scenarios there with your Fleet Street and various other things.
Yes.
I'd love to see the scenario of free public transport modelled in there.
Free public transport.
It's been done elsewhere.
Well, it's done in places here.
And there's various efficiency arguments and whatever else, but I think it's a fair enough scenario to include considering all the other things done.
It is, except so in our Fleet Street scenario, which has the highest public transport use, most lines are already exceeding their capacity. So we would have to, so it would necessitate a further change to the model of a bunch of new infrastructure investments that aren't planned or committed. So we would essentially have to make up a new infrastructure network, which we don't really have, certainly don't have scope to do for the length of this project, but it's an interesting point.
I hope you're not going to give this to the politicians and the media, because we'll never, ever, no one will ever understand it. I'll just fight about it for months and years. But the real point is, how are you going to get all this information across and educate people? And, you know, because there's a huge amount of information that I had never thought of, even though I own an electric vehicle. You know, I see the benefits of it. But, you know, you're doing a great job, I think, in looking at the whole scenario. But there's a lot of information that you're going to have to get across to the great unwashed out there. How are you going to do that? Because already the people think that automatic vehicles are, you know, every time that Tesla runs into someone, you know, the end of the world's going to come and so on. And I mean, I just despair at your getting this across to the public.
It's a good question.
Is that your role, though?
No, not really. So we've got this. So the best we can do, so we published our evidence-based report, which is a more detailed look at this. I've just lifted up the things that I found most interesting, which I think says a lot about me. And there's all the technical reports that underpin this have also been released. So I guess there are two answers I would give, is that one, I don't know how we're going to communicate it to the masses. Two, the audience that we see for this is mainly kind of stakeholders. Like, we're trying to convince government and industry, or make government and industry aware of the challenges that maybe and the opportunities that they hadn't seen or considered. We're very, or internally at IV, we're all very optimistic about automated vehicles. Like, we've done this work and we see that it's all very exciting and the possibilities are quite extreme, but equally we have to kind of be a bit realistic. You know, a lot of our assumptions are probably very optimistic. There's probably will never be a scenario where all vehicles are privately owned. I mean, all vehicles are shared and automated. So we have to kind of temper our excitement. But I think I'm not a great believer in how markets operate necessarily, but I think over time, I mean, attitudes shift. Everyone's got an iPhone, like, things happen. So I just kind of trust the technology will kind of prove itself over time, and it'll become compelling.
So I'm aware that something's happening at Vic Roads as well in terms of the AV. I'm sure you know about that. But I mean, that's, I guess, the question before again. I don't think it's a case of educating, it's just modelling of what may or may not happen, is the way I read your report here.
Yes. And
it's a case then also of whether market forces or regulation either way shapes that future. And now, I mean, I'm an engineer in the solar space. It's interesting to see the distortions that happen one way or another by having impact either regulatory or market forces and how the energy sector unfolds. And people attribute it to one thing or another, but it's not. Some people say it's regulation. No, it's market forces that's driving it.
Yep.
I mean, a lot of the green groups believe that they shut down Hazelwood. No, it was an economic reason. At the end of the day, that's simple. And so it's pretty simple. That's the case of economics, and it's going to be when we get a congested city now, that AVs, where you do the Jetsons hop on, hop off, it's going to be for economic reasons rather than anything else. It's going to drive all these things, as I see it.
Yeah, I mean, we're an interesting case study in our team, because we've got an ex-GM automotive engineer who's kind of our vehicles expert, and he's a petrol head and he loves cars. I live in Fitzroy and I don't have a driver's license. So the way that we approach our internal approach to vehicles, he's got a very reluctant to give up private ownership and kind of, you'll take the steering wheel out of my cold dead hands kind of approach. Whereas I've got a very, I don't see the merit in owning a car. Why don't we all transition to an automated taxi scenario? It seems to make so much sense. And that's just the behavioural differences that I think hopefully the market will hopefully resolve. As I said, people kind of see the merits of these technologies over time. But I don't think that transition will ever fully happen. There will still be recreational drivers and things like that.
Yeah, we're working with a company that did the Internet of Things in terms of energy space and various things, and they were in Silicon Valley. They pretty much said the technology's there now, but we aren't culturally ready to sit in a car that doesn't have a driver, whereas our kids maybe or otherwise do that. So it's a cultural change amongst anything else. And even in terms of the electrical space, there's so much going on in terms of sub-metering, metering. So we talked last night at Monash in town, but it's a culmination. It will unfold. It's like anything we've evolved from the horse and cart, but in what way, shape, or form, we don't know. But I think the economics is going to be the ultimate one that will basically do that on that basis. But that's pretty much what I'm seeing what you're doing here.
Yeah.
Okay. That's it. So thank you very much, Steve, for
that's all right.
a very interesting talk. And
I'll just
people talk to you afterwards if they wish.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've got our contact details for Infrastructure Victoria there. All our reports, technical reports, the evidence base is on the website, and we're releasing our advice to the Minister in the coming weeks, and hopefully it will be released pre-election.
Yeah. Can you make sure you've all signed the attendance sheet? And there's a GoalCon donation on the way out, and we have to clear this place up by 9 o'clock. So thanks for that. Oh yes, and the next meeting is going to be electrifying industry, which will be the BZE report on that topic, and that'll be next month here, third Wednesday of the month.
Thank you all for coming.
So you think the spokesperson for this, or you develop